Is one of those passages of Scripture that we sit back and half the time wonder what in the world and why is it here. But let me stress to you that the entire book of Leviticus, as a reminder, it has to do with the life of the Israelites, the life of purity, the life of holiness. And it reminds us continuously it's not just a Sabbath day holiness, but a week-long, lifelong holiness. We've often talked in the Protestant church and in the Christian church in general that there are Sunday Christians, those that are here on Sunday and are here for the Lord on Sunday, but once Monday hits, that's another story. They give one day to the Lord, the rest is theirs. They try to act right, act properly, act holy when they're in church, but as soon as they hit the parking lot, that's another story. And yet, the book of Leviticus reminds us that holiness permeates every part of our life. In order for us to really understand this chapter, I believe we must go to the New Testament. And what we're going to discover, if you turn with me to the book of Mark, chapter 5, we'll read this in just a moment. But the one thing that I believe you will discover in this chapter is the understanding of Leviticus chapter 15. For the events that take place in this chapter move back to Leviticus chapter 15 for our understanding. And it reminds us that the New Testament actually helps us understand the Old. The Old Testament, of course, is the precursor to the New Testament. It lays the foundation and the groundwork for the Messiah, for who he is, who he was to be, and what he was to do. The New Testament fulfills all of those prophecies of the Messiah and helps us understand exactly what a lot of these passages have to do with in their fulfillment. Well, what we will see first off as we get into it, number one, very clearly, is that what we're going to see is life before Christ and life after Christ. Life before Christ and life after Christ. Excuse me. That in this passage that we already read in our New Testament reading of the Gospel of Luke's viewpoint, we're going to see the Gospel of Mark's viewpoint because it makes a few things a little bit clearer in our understanding. So turn with me, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. It says this: Now when Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. Verse 22, And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, saying, My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live. So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed and thronged him. Verse 25, Now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years, and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well. Verse 29, Immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that the power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, Who touched my clothes? But his disciples said to him, You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, Who touched me? And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. Verse 35, While he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house, who said, Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, Do not be afraid, only believe. Verse 37, and he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Then he came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult, and those who wept and wailed loudly. When he came in, he said to them, why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they ridiculed him. But when he put them all outside, he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him and entered where the child was lying. Then he took the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha cumi, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, arise. Immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age, and they were overcome with great amazement. But he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given her to eat. So here's the story, and you know the story because we've read it twice essentially this morning. And you've known the story for years. If you've gone to church for years, you've heard it, the story of this woman with the blood. But notice how it all begins. You have this ruler of the synagogue, Jairus, and he is a ruler. Notice again, he's a ruler of the synagogue. He's not just a member, he's one of the rulers, which means he's a very prominent individual within the synagogue itself. Which means also most likely he's rather wealthy, and we'll discover later that he actually is wealthy. But here he is, this ruler who shows up somewhat out of the blue to Jesus. And he walks up to them. He falls at Jesus' feet with all the disciples and all of this crowd around him. He wiggles his way through the crowd, falls down at the feet of Jesus, and he begs him, he says, my little daughter lies at the point of death. Understand, in the Greek, the word for death is thanatos. But that's not the word used here. The word in the Greek here is eschatos. Now, that word is used in theology quite a bit. In fact, many of you love eschatology, which is where we get the word from, is the word eschatos. Eschatology means the study of the final things or the last things. If you've ever read the book of Revelation, wished to know about the prophecies, look throughout the Old Testament and New Testament of the prophecies of the return of the Messiah, the second coming of Jesus, of wanting to know the end of this world, you are studying eschatology. The word eschatos means final or last things. This is the word the man uses about his daughter. I'm sure our translators in all of the scriptures and all the different various translations almost struggled by using that word to help us understand she's at the point of death. But the word here, according to what the Greek tells us, Jairus comes to Jesus and says, come and lay your hands, my little daughter lies at the final moments, at the very last. Not just at the point of death, but at her very last. That seems a little bit more final, a little bit more permanent than just she lies at the point of death. How many times have we known people that we thought they're going to be gone in a matter of a day or so? I know my grandmother, she was in a home. She had, I believe it was a stroke. One of my brothers swung by and saw her on the way down south and said they don't expect her to live another 24 hours after he stopped at the hospital. The woman lived another 7 years. We may think someone's at the point of death, and they're not. But the word he uses here is not that word of death, but the final, the last. It's it. And if you don't hurry, Jesus, it's going to be too late. That last breath will have been gone. And so, as he lays at the feet of Jesus, explains all of this, verse 24 in Mark 5, so Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed and thronged him. He was in this crowd. They were jostling him back and forth. You ever try to move through a crowd? I know it will be different this year, but have you ever gone to Black Friday? With all of the crowds, with all of the people moving, you always have seen it, at least we have on the news, of the people busting through doors, crushing people, stepping on people, do all of these things to get a good deal on a cheap TV. It's amazing what people will do to each other to get what they view as a good deal. And so here is Jesus. People knew about Jesus. People heard about Jesus. Some had witnessed his miracles. And so they're thronging him. They're jostling him. They're going to follow him because after all, here is this little girl at the final stage, the last of the breaths. And he is going to go there and lay hands on this little girl. And so all the crowd is wanting to go with him. And they're moving and jostling and pushing him. Verse 25, now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years. If your Bible is like mine with all the little reference points in it, it will even refer you back to Leviticus chapter 15, starting with verse 19. So if you have that type of study Bible, it undoubtedly will refer you back to our very passage this morning. That's why this becomes important for us. She has a flow of blood for 12 years. That will become important later. And had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. Now, according to Leviticus chapter 15, you remember with what we had just read, all the things that happened during a woman's normal time of impurity, as it's called. That week-long process. But what happens when it extends beyond that? You remember, this woman, during her time of impurity, if you touch anything she has touched, you're unclean. If you sit on anything she sat on, you're unclean. If you lay in the bed she had laid on, you're unclean. So what happens during that normal time of impurity, a husband and wife may not lay in the same bed. She may sit on a chair or in a corner of a room for that time and not sit where anybody else sits. No one is allowed to touch her because that would make them unclean. But if it goes beyond that week, that same uncleanness continues. In fact, what we discover through all of this is that this woman, having a flow of blood for 12 years, most likely was divorced. Or, since we don't know her age, she was never allowed to marry. She could not live in her own home. She was ostracized from society. She was not allowed to come into contact with her friends. Certainly not allowed to ever go into a synagogue or ever go into the temple. And what do we know? 12 years this had gone on for her. It tells us that she had suffered many things from many physicians. This is verse 26 of Mark 5. She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had 12 years of agony. 12 years of suffering. 12 years of social devastation. 12 years of religious devastation. 12 years of physical devastation. And 12 years of financial devastation. Social ruin, religious ruin, physical ruin, financial ruin. Listen again to what it says. She had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. She was completely broke at this point after spending all of her money on the doctors. And it says she had suffered many things from many physicians. Now understand, they did not have the medical advances we have today. That's clear. But according to the Talmud, according to the Hebraica, which gives us understanding of all of this, and tells us actual physical remedies to such a thing. According to the Talmud and Hebraica, if a woman has a flux, has a flow of blood longer than her normal period and needs to be cured from it, Ladies, you are to take the gum of Alexandria, the weight of Zuzi, and of alum, the weight of a Zuzi, and of Crocus hortensis, the weight of a Zuzi. Let them be bruised together and be given in wine to the woman with the flux. If that does not benefit, you are to take of Persian onions thrice 3 logs, that means basically 9, boil them in wine, give her to drink it, and say, "Arise from thy flux." If that does not work, you are to set her in a place where 2 ways meet. Think of like a fork in a road. Let her hold a cup of wine in her hand. Are you seeing a theme here? Holding a cup of wine in her hand, let somebody come behind her, frighten her, and say, "Arise from thy flux." If that does not work, you are to take a handful of cumin, and a handful of crocus, and a handful of grokum, boiled in a wine, drink, and someone say, "Arise from thy flux." If that does not work, you are to dig 7 ditches. Burn cuttings of vines that are less than 4 years old. You let her take a cup of wine in her hand, lead her from this ditch and make her sit down over a different one, then remove her from that one and sit at another one for each of the 7 ditches, and in every removal say, "Arise from thy flux." That was the cure. One of them. These were the things she would have been doing. This is the money she would have been paying. Remember, not allowed to be around friends, no family, either divorced or not allowed to be married. So she had to hire someone to come from behind her and scare her. She had to hire someone to dig the ditches and take the cuttings and burn them. She had to hire someone to do all these different things and pay the physician for this advice. At each step, physician would say the first one and say, "If that did, okay, come back to me if that doesn't work." And just as you go back to get a second opinion, you pay that doctor. This had gone on for 12 years. Which takes us to our second point. We are prone to try all the worldly methods first. We are prone to try all the worldly methods first. Remember, the crowds are jostling Jesus. And she somehow gets through the crowd. Now stop for a moment. She's unclean. She's not allowed to be there. If anyone knows who she is, they would immediately start screaming, "Unclean, unclean," pointing at her, and people may start picking up rocks and throwing them at her. She is weaving her way through this crowd. It says, when she heard, verse 27, about Jesus, she came from behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. The crowds are jostling him. She's probably getting jostled herself. She reaches up and she touches him. Why does she touch him? Because she believes she can be cured. Isn't it amazing in some respects that she didn't give up long ago? That she didn't throw in the towel and say, "Never mind, it's never going to happen." But it says, when she heard about Jesus, what did she hear about? Undoubtedly the miracles that had been happening, the things that had been taking place. And in verse 28, for she said, now the word there doesn't mean she spoke out loud. She said it to herself. She talked to herself. As we all do, whether we wish to admit it or not, we all talk to ourselves. It's just sad when we start arguing with ourselves and lose the argument. That becomes the sad part. But she talked to herself. "If only I may touch his clothes, I will be made well." What does she say? If only I touch his clothes. Not if I just touch his clothes. It's not all I have to do is touch some clothes. Because that was saying what? She did not have faith in the clothes. You understand, there was a lot of superstition at that time, though. There was superstition that said, if I get a piece of a garment of some famous person, we still do the same things. Give me an autograph of a famous person. Give me something that a famous person owned. We see homes being sold for millions of dollars more than they're worth because somebody famous lived there at one time. We see guitars and different things that are sold because they were played by some famous person, and then all of a sudden they're worth a whole lot more. In this case, there were those that believed in the magic, the superstition, that said if somebody, some miracle worker, somebody who was of great faith held a piece of clothing and you got that piece of clothing, that would help you. And of course, we do not believe that today. Nobody believes that just some famous preacher might use a handkerchief, or if you give a donation, send you a handkerchief or a piece of cloth in the mail, and that will help you get healed. Certainly, no one believes that today. But what happens? She reaches out through the crowd, touches that hem of his garment. Verse 29, immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. You notice when Jesus heals people, he doesn't take a long time to do it. In every situation, Jesus doesn't tell the person to come back in 3 months and let's see how you're doing. The people are healed that day, immediately in this case. As often in almost every single case, Jesus touches and immediately they're healed. Only one other time did the man say, when Jesus touched him and healed him, did the man say, I see men like trees walking, and Jesus touched him again and he was healed. That was it. It didn't take long. Jesus healed people. He did it immediately. The fountain of her blood was dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction, of all of the suffering. It was said, it was done, it was over. And Jesus, immediately knowing, verse 30, in himself that the power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? His disciples said to him, you see the multitude thronging you. They're jostling you. They're pushing you every which way. And you say, who touched me? Lord, do you want us to start taking names? What are you talking about? You want us just to have everybody freeze in place and us walk around with a papyrus and a pen and start writing down everybody's names who ever touched you? That's impossible. Do you see this crowd, Lord? And who knows who touched you before and who touched you 2 minutes ago? He looked around to see her who had done this thing. He looked straight at her. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Remember in Luke, the Gospel of Luke in chapter 8, with how he tells us is he responds to the disciples when they say, Lord, come on. Be realistic. Who touched me? He says, no. It was a different touch. I felt power go out from me. It was a special touch. There was a healing touch. Somebody touched me and was healed. Who was it? And again, the disciples would have been lost. How are we supposed to know? But Jesus, according to Mark, Jesus turns, looked around to see her who had done this thing. Jesus turned and looked straight at her. But the woman, verse 33, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. You know, you think Jesus is on his way to see Jairus' household, to see this little girl who was at her final moments, the last breath about to leave her body. And Jesus stops. Wonder what Jairus was thinking. Lord, what are you doing? Why are you stopping? We have no time. And the woman, who probably planned to slip away and get lost in the crowd, but Jesus turns around, he stops her, he stares at her, and he gets from her, he elicits from her this wonderful testimony of what had been going on and what happened. And she explained everything, and you have to think about what that explanation must have said. It was me, Lord. I touched you. I was healed immediately. She didn't say, oh Lord, it was an accident. Oh Lord, I had this little problem and voila, thank you. She probably fell at his feet and said, Lord, for 12 years. How else would the gospel writers know this? For 12 years, Lord, I've had a flow of blood. For 12 years I've been unclean. I've gone to so many doctors. I've spent every penny I've had. And I have not gotten better. It has just gotten worse. I've gotten divorced, or I haven't gotten married. I can't live in my home. I have to live outside the city. I can't go to the synagogue. I can't go to the temple. For 12 years, I've been this way. And Lord, when I touched you, I was unclean, and I just made you unclean. I'm sorry, but I know I've been healed. I can feel it. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. Notice he didn't say your touch made you better. He didn't say my clothes made you better. He calls her daughter. Remember, she'd been ostracized from society. Daughter. And that word go in peace, actually the word in the Greek there means go into peace. Go into peace. She'd been suffering. She'd been in agony. She'd lost everything. Family, friends, finances, everything. He says, you're not going into ruin anymore, you're going into peace. Go into peace. Be healed from your affliction. Why did Jesus deal with her this way? Why did he not simply permit her to remain anonymous, go on her way? I think two reasons. Number one, he did it for her own sake. He wanted her to be. He wanted to be to her something more than just a healer. He wanted to be the Savior. And I think maybe he also did it for the sake of Jairus. Do you remember the events when Lazarus was sick? The brother of Mary and Martha, and they sent him a message, Lord, the one in whom you love is sick. Basically, come and heal him. And Jesus stalls. He stalls for 3 days. He waits. And then he tells his disciples, okay, let's go. It's time to go. And someone brings the message, it's too late. Lazarus is sleeping. The disciples, immediately Thomas, was the one going, now wait a minute, Lord, wait, you don't want to go back there. Last time we were there, they tried to kill us. Particularly you. You don't want to go back there. They'll try to kill you again, and they may be successful. Our brother is sleeping, referring to his death. Our brother said, well, if he's sleeping, he'll get better. You don't need to go there. She says, no, you're not getting it. Lazarus is dead. And so I'm going. Thomas's response is, well, that's it. He's going. They're going to kill him. We might as well all go and die together. We'll all go together when we go. And Jesus gets there. He'd been in the tomb for 3 days. And of course, Lazarus come forth. Remember that. Here the message comes. Jairus hears it. Verse 35, while he was still speaking, some came from the ruler of the synagogue's house who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not be afraid, only believe. See, the third thing that happened here is knowing life before Christ, life after Christ, after understanding that we are so prone to try all the worldly methods first. The third thing that happens there is she had shared her testimony, right? Number 3, she'd shared her testimony. Jairus heard it. He's standing right next to Jesus. Jesus is following him to his house. Jairus saw it and heard it, again, probably wondering, please, lady, now's not the time. Come and touch him later. My daughter needs him now. You've lived with this for 12 years. Another, hour and a half isn't going to hurt you. Jairus was probably just beside himself with anxiety because of all of this delay. How in the world could Jesus just keep standing there talking to a woman when his daughter was dying? And this messenger comes, informs him the child is dead. But Jesus ignores that, doesn't he? He ignores this report completely. When it says, your daughter is dead, why trouble the teacher any further? As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not be afraid, only believe. Don't listen to that. Ignore that report. And he arrives. Verse 37, he permits no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And he comes to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and saw a tumult and those who wept and wailed loudly. So by the time he gets there, there's already the mourners. Now understand, we don't follow this, but back then there were actually laws and rules about having professional mourners. We don't do that. We don't pay someone to show up at our house after somebody's died and weep and wail and make all kinds of commotion and noise and what have you. But according to the rulers of the synagogue, according to all of the rules, no matter how rich or poor you were required, when someone died, to hire 2 flute players and 1 mourner. That was the bare minimum. So when you had a loved one who died, if you couldn't afford much of nothing, you still had to hire and get 2 flute players and 1 professional mourner at your house. But here it says that it's a tumult. In other words, it was a large crowd that undoubtedly his wife had already hired by the time he got home. Now this could have happened over a 2-hour period because Jairus left. It might have taken an hour to get there to find Jesus. Who knows exactly? But he finds Jesus, and maybe she died just a few minutes after Jairus leaves. She sends the messenger following Jairus, so many minutes behind, because this woman stops him who had the flow of blood. This healing takes place. Just a short conversation happens. Probably not more than 5 minutes, and a man walks up and says she's dead. So probably within 5 or 10 minutes after Jairus leaves, she dies. He then takes another hour to get home, and in that perhaps 2-hour span, the wife, the mother, had already gotten the professional mourners there. And a tumult was taking place, a loud noise in this household and around the household, which means, again, being the ruler of the synagogue, he was wealthy and therefore had hired a rather large crowd of mourning. Jesus walks into this. He comes in, verse 39, says to them, why make this commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they ridiculed him. He's laughed at. All of a sudden, the professional mourners stop their weeping and wailing and screaming and look at him and start laughing and go, oh, you're stupid. You don't think we know what's dead and what's not dead? She's dead. What are you doing here? Forget it. Go away. Thanks for coming, Rabbi, but you're too late. All the ridicule and the laughter. They stopped all the mourning just to ridicule Jesus, but that shouldn't surprise us because unbelievers still ridicule Jesus and his followers. He puts them all outside. Some people wonder how he did that. perhaps physically in some respects. Jesus did not have a problem with that. Remember, he cleansed the temple twice. One time he made a whip out of cords and turned over tables and chased people around with a whip. Not exactly gentle Jesus, meek and mild here. But he chased them all out of the house, however he did it, pushed them, shoved them, said, get out, go, go. He took the father, the mother, and those who were with him, Peter, James, and John, and entered where the child was lying. Then he took the child by the hand. Stop there. She's dead. She is completely dead. She's not in a coma. Jesus didn't tell him, oh, you only think she's dead, but she's in a coma here. She's not asleep. She is dead. And what does Jesus do? Reach down and touch her by the hand. You do know, and you do remember, in Leviticus, to touch a dead body makes you unclean. Second time in a day, he becomes unclean. The woman touched him. By all the laws, he's unclean. He touches a dead body. He's unclean. 2 times in the same day. He takes the child by the hand and said to her, Talitha Kumi. Aramaic, which is one of his native tongues. Jesus would have spoken Aramaic most likely in his home, Hebrew in the greater society, and perhaps even Greek, because that was the international language of the time of the Roman Empire. But he speaks Aramaic because, after all, the ruler of the synagogue would have clearly spoken Aramaic in the home. It's similar to Hebrew, but different. And he says, Talitha Kumi, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, arise. It perhaps a little bit more literally than little girl, it could be translated little lamb, like a term of endearment. And you wonder, why did he use those words? Maybe. Because remember, you had not seen the mother in any of this until now. The mother probably stayed by her bedside while her father ran to go get Jesus. All of a sudden, the mother appears in the story. Maybe that's the very words which the little girl's mother usually wakened her up in the morning. Little lamb, time to get up. Talitha Kumi. Time to arise. Immediately, see, there's that word again. Just as the woman with the flow, immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age. The woman had the flow of blood for 12 years. Here this little girl's 12 years of age. By the way, she's still called a little girl still, because up until 12 years of age, you're a little girl. At the age of 13, you become a young woman in the Hebrew society. So she's 12 years of age. She stands up. She walks. She was not a baby. She was not a toddler. She's getting into adolescence, and there she is, 12 years of age. And they're overcome with great amazement. Verse 43, but he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and said that something should be given her to eat. No one should know it. He could have made a public display of this, couldn't he? He could have gone outside, grabbed all those mourners, drug them back in and said, see, I told you. He could have taken the woman who had the flux for 12 years and made a great display. Everybody see her? It's because of me. I let her touch my clothes. It's all about me. Look at what I've done. He didn't have her sent. He never took somebody who was deaf and then put them on one side of the platform and walked over and said, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? He never made a public display of his healing. Why not? He could have. Because his basis was all about faith. Do you recall after he fed the 5,000? He goes and prays and sends his disciples across the sea. And then he walks on the water, gets into the boat with them, gets on the other side. And people were amazed. They said, wait a minute, when did you get here? Because you were still back there, and here are your disciples. How'd you get here? You should have been, a couple hours behind. And Jesus basically asked them, why are you here? Well, we think you're the Messiah. He responds, you only think I'm the Messiah because I fed you. Because you saw that miracle and I fed you. That's the only reason you believe. Oh, no, we believe. And no, you only believe because I fed you. Will you still believe? Sure, we'll believe, we'll follow you, you're the Messiah, if you feed us breakfast now. That's essentially what they said. Give us breakfast and we'll believe you. In other words, we never have to work again. This is great. Follow you around all day long. We get all the food we need. We got clothing. Somebody's sick, you'll touch them. We're all good here. Jesus was never about public display. He was about a private faith. Yes, he would elicit testimony from people. Yes, sometimes crowds saw him do what he did, but it was never about completely him and his power and his authority. It was about building people's faith. That's why he didn't look to the woman and say, your touch made you whole. My clothes made you whole. I slapped you on the forehead and made you whole. Your faith. And what your faith was in, which was me, made you whole. Leviticus 15 tells us all about uncleanness from a man and a woman. The next time you read the Gospels and you see this passage, you remember what this woman went through according to the law of Leviticus 15 that she was under. Social ruin, religious ruin, physical ruin, financial ruin, and agony for 12 years until she met Jesus. See, her life, what it was like before Christ and after Christ, were two different things. And I'm willing to say it's the same thing for you. What your life was before Christ and what your life was after Christ is completely different. Because he was willing to allow someone unclean to touch him. And he was willing to touch someone unclean. Let's sing one last time this morning. Stand with me if you will.